Hi there. The purpose of this lecture is mostly to describe the system diagram for consciousness. Uh, Before I get to that part of the idea, I'm going to talk about, some kind of disease types, and I'll talk about what I call the HOSL or HOSL. It's the underlying uh, operating system, human operating system language that, according to this theory, we all have. So it'll be an example of a disease that highlights a particular feature of the human architecture, the language that the operating system runs on, and how that manifests itself in the way that we communicate and so on. And then I'll explain a system architecture diagram for what I see the system consciousness looking like. So, just to get started, I'll talk about uh, Parkinson's disease, and they suffer from what's called proprioception. And according to this theory, we have a virtual self and a physical self, and as I've described in other lectures, and they're synced up uh, in the system consciousness. You've got the kind of the messaging from the physical self and the messaging from the virtual self, and those two need to be really in sync with each other in order for one to be able to do tasks effectively according to this idea. I'll drill down into it in more detail later, and I'll show which parts are actually hardwired to be more efficient for the physical self as opposed to the virtual self. But essentially, people who have Parkinson's have a lot of trouble um, with coordinating their brain with their body. I won't go into the detail of it because I'm not an expert, but it's known to be related to dopamine messaging. But in this theory, it's related to the virtual centers versus the physical centers. So a person can imagine doing what they want to do, but their body, the messaging they get from their body doesn't really work very well. So that's the concept there: virtual being, physical being, and then something like Parkinson's, which makes life very very difficult. Um, Next, I'll talk about language in the brain. This is all very high level stuff at the moment. Mostly, I just want to talk about the fact that if you kind of look at human beings, we have so many different languages out there. There's from one country to another, people have different vocabulary. There's different grammar. There's different sounds and so on. And um, human beings seem to be able to develop a language and kind of share it amongst groups of themselves. And they just kind of make it up, and then you go across some border and they're speaking some other language and they all know what they're talking about. So as human beings, this seems to be just the way we work. You've got a group of people living in one place, they develop some kind of a language, and then you go to another place, it's another language. So you've French, you've German, and so on, Japanese, and you've Cantonese, Chinese, and all these different types of languages. So how does that really? So what we're really more interested in this theory isn't the fact that there are so many languages, but the reason behind it and what's going on there. So according to this theory, uh, there's an underlying operating system language, messaging language, where that the body uses to communicate with itself. This messaging protocol is, I call it the HOSL, HOSL. And essentially what it is it's the native messaging system that the body has, independent of learning a language or learning how to draw anything or whatever. So, you have the idea of the feral child who never learns language and never develops in the human way, but they have certain core abilities that just come naturally to the child. So the idea there is that a learning mechanism that we go through, and according to this theory, there's mapping mechanisms that map the HOSL or the OSL operating system language to the locale, and the rules of the locale vary from one place to another. But the basic idea is that our bodies have an underlying message algebra and operating system language which is independent of the locale. And then as we grow and we go to school and we learn how to read and we learn how to write and we learn how to talk, there's a mapping mechanism. So we're mapping what we learned back to the underlying operating system language, the HOSL that we have. Everyone has it, so that's the basic idea. So the idea is that you might call it the Chomsky universal grammar, but the basic idea is it's an underlying ability within human beings, independent of being taught the particular skill. There's just an underlying ability in the messaging in the body, HOSL. And again, the same approach is taken to written languages. That I'll talk about this more later. But basically, we map human message algebra to many spoken languages and many written languages. And some examples would be when we learn languages. There's people talk about the semantic context, but there's also visual contexts. If you say, "Please give me a hand" to a robot, what you mean is "help me." But if the robot was to take that literally, it means give me somebody's hand, like physically a physical hand. So the idea here in this piece is that there's visual algebra in the meaning of things. The visual algebra is that the robot stands next to the person issuing the instruction and awaits instruction from the issuer how to assist, and says things like, "How may I assist?" And then you wait for so many seconds to see if that's the case. So that's the idea. The idea is that there's underlying algebra which actually maps to the actual term, "please give me a hand" to a robot. So basically, we have the funny little phrases, and they need to be turned into messaging algebra. And what I argue in this document is that is what we're doing in our brains. We're mapping these sentences into our underlying algebra. I talk here a little bit about picking up a cup and coordination, and I talk about the physical self versus the virtual self, and I argue that it makes it a bit easier if you have a virtual version where you can predict what you're going to do next in order to achieve your task. Later I'll talk about dedicated circuits within the body. So our body, it turns out, has dedicated circuitry for the motor skills and the dedicated circuits for the kind of virtual skills. So the virtual versus the physical. So there's actual wiring in the brain to kind of handle one part which is physical and one part which is the virtual part. So they're separated out, and I'll talk about that later in the document. And I talk about context messaging and system consciousness actions. So these are just actions that are turned into messages, like turn the light on, press a button, and so on. And these are the kind of messages that are stored in the brain. For example, according to this theory, if a mouse learns how to do a task, so it can record and build a mental picture of a location in a memory room, and then it can have a series of actions within that memory room, which it can then put into its physical system, and then it can solve a particular operation. But the idea here is that the way it does it is it has the ability to create these memory rooms where it remembers how the structure of a room looks like actually in its brain, and in these algebra, visual algebra, which goes into these rooms, and then you have associated kind of problem solving semantic messages which sort of explain the steps that one needs to achieve. I'll talk about that later, but it's basically message stories. I talk just briefly about attention deficit, and basically, according to what I'm saying here, is that messages are not processed as fast as the information is being received, so the information is lost. So the idea is there's like The idea is there's not only messages going into the system, into the brain. There's also the rate at which they come into the brain and the rate at which they're processed. So there's a fine tuning aspect to the messages, and if a body can't process the messages fast enough compared to the inputs, then the person will fall behind in terms of their understanding. And we have terms that relate to that, like the attention deficit, where the person maybe can't keep up with what they're being taught, and maybe a lot of the time you get kids or people being prescribed stimulants of some kind to speed up the message processing in the brain, according to this theory. Hyperactivity is when you've too many messages going through the SC. So the messages, and then the child might appear to be just jumping around the place a lot. But if one just thinks of it in terms of a messaging system, think of a lot of more messages going through the system consciousness than a kid who doesn't do it. So it's like a fine tuning thing again. Too many messages going through, too many actions, and then maybe that manifests itself in hyperactivity. I'll talk later about this, but we have the concept of long and short-term memory. This is all pretty important. I have a chapter on this, but the basic idea is that we do have a short-term memory and a long-term memory, and there's an important. These two are both very important mechanisms by which messages are stored in these temporary locations, and then using some kind of a storage mechanism, which I'll go into later into the brain architecture. I'll show how that works. They get stored in long-term memory. Pretty important stuff, and what's really telling about memory is if one sees documentaries on people who lose their memories, in many ways they lose their identities, and how we build up our self, through our experiences in our lives, and some really interesting documentaries around this whole topic. But I think of it in terms of messages, stories stored in the short term, placed in the long term, and I explain how goals can be kind of mapped to these various memories in order to achieve goal-based intelligence later. Mapping a brain signal to a message type. So again, this is more kind of the kind of engineering side of it. So what we have is in the brain we have, like in the neurons, we have signals. So there must be a mechanism there to map a signal strength to a message type. A lot of the time we have protein-based messages in the brain too. An interesting thing here is addiction. So what I'm trying to do here is to talk about well-known problems that people have, and behaviors, and try to map those ideas to messaging. So we talk about addiction, we talk about willpower goals and strong neural pathways. So addiction tends to be pretty much like addictive behaviors would tend to be that, in this theory, how that you want to describe that. You might design an android, and you might have has a certain set of goals, and it's firing too many goals of a certain kind and through the SC too much, and the android might be doing the same thing too much. Now, if you're on a production line, maybe building, I don't know, some object, you might think that's a good thing. But if you're at home and you're constantly washing your hands, for example, or you're constantly doing a particular behavior over and over again, and you can never do it enough times, that would maybe indicate, according to this theory, that there's a part of the brain that is producing certain messaging, which is just repeating and repeating and repeating, and doesn't sort of kind of end. You might have people who drink too much, or whatever, they eat too much, or whatever. So according to this theory, there's messaging to do these actions, and they're going through the system consciousness too much, and therefore people maybe eat too much, or they drink too much, or they have what one would call addictive behaviors. Now, finally, on this lecture, I want to talk about the system consciousness architecture diagram. And this is kind of a very important first step into understanding the architecture I'm proposing. And basically, we talk about the HOS, and we talk about an emergency, such as being chased by a tiger. So in that case, so what we have is We have, high priority messaging such as like emergency chased by tiger, and these messages, for example, will be processed within sort of a queue aggregator uh, place in the brain. There, and I'll explain physically where I think that is in the current human brain. But this is the kind of conceptual model. So we have these different messages coming in, like sound, touch, and vision. We have various HOS messages, and we have things like dopamine and serotonin messages. And we have goal-based messages. They go into queue aggregators. Some of them are paired. Some messages are related to thinking, and then we do lookups in the system memory, and then we retrieve message stories, and some are stored in long and short-term memory. So the idea here, really simply, is some of these output messages end up going into to go into a circuit, so to speak. They go around through the brain and back again, in again. Some of them go to our motor function, such as lift the cup to have the cup of tea, and then some of them go to our virtual self, into these uh, system consciousness rooms where we think. And then some of them are like what make us human. They're emotions. You might get an emotional response to something. Maybe something may happen, and then you have emotional reaction. So the idea in the theory is that emotions, although they're in a particular part of the brain, there is what I would call emotional algebra. So basically, further on, I'll discuss a list of the different kind of message types, part of the Husserl, which form these algebras, and they interact with parts of our brains, and then as human beings, we feel certain feelings, happiness or sadness or whatever. But the idea of the architecture is all of that messaging goes through this system, this system consciousness piece, which is this aggregator. Now there's other bits to it later, like the visualization rooms, and there's things like the system behaves differently when you're asleep to when you're awake, and so on. But this is the basic core idea. Some messages come in, some are aggregated, some have higher priority. There's a speed at which they come through. There's certain types of messages that dominate, therefore you get maybe certain kind of behaviors that are addictive or whatever. And then there's the things that make us who we are, all the memories we have in these message stories. And this is the simplified architecture, but it's a good start. And then you've this idea of if you're chased by a tiger, a message like that comes into your brain, you just run, and our bodies are designed to take certain messages, and we just stop thinking and we run, and we survive. Okay, and then later on I'm going to start talking about message stories, but that's it for now. This is mostly about the system consciousness and the different kinds of behaviors we have.